The fresh air of the Oregon forest filled my lungs as I helped Ben set up the tent. The tall trees stood like silent guardians, and the bird songs created a natural symphony that enveloped us. I was excited for this weekend camping trip, a getaway from the stressful city routine. "If I don't come back with a horror story, then I didn't do it right," Ben said, laughing as he struggled to fit the tent poles together. "Oh, come on. You're going to scare us before the night even falls," I replied, trying to keep the mood light. It was typical of Ben to joke about urban legends, especially in places like this, where nature seemed alive with its own energy. He began telling the story of a spirit that supposedly roamed the forest, luring people into its trap. "They say that those who hear its whisper are never seen again," he said, with an exaggeratedly serious expression. "Don't tell me you actually believe those stories," Sarah interjected, unrolling her sleeping bag. She had always been the most sensible one in the group. "They're just stories to scare kids. Don't let that get to you, Ben." But there was something in her gaze that betrayed a hint of discomfort. I noticed that despite her words, the forest seemed to carry a weight that couldn't be ignored. "Come on. Where's your sense of adventure?" Ben insisted, with a teasing smile. "I think we need a little excitement. Look around. It's all so perfect. An ideal place for legends to arise." He was right about the beauty of the place. Sunlight filtered through the leaves, creating dancing patterns on the moss-covered ground. But at the same time, a strange feeling began to settle in my chest, as if the forest were watching our every move. As we arranged our things, I couldn't help but notice that Sarah seemed a bit distant. She had a faraway look in her eyes, as if she were thinking about something much deeper than simply setting up the tent. Seizing a moment of pause, I approached her. "Hey, are you okay?" I asked, trying to break the silence that seemed to envelop her mind. She turned slowly to me, her eyes reflecting a mix of sadness and nostalgia. "I remember my brother here," she said, her voice soft and melancholic. "He used to take me camping when we were kids. The forest reminds me of him." The silence that followed was heavy. Her words floated in the air, and I realized that behind the facade of enthusiasm, there was an abyss of emotions we were unaware of. "I'm sorry, I didn't know," I replied, feeling like I had touched on something sensitive. "If you need someone to talk to, I'm here." Ben was around, joking about mosquitoes, but the weight of what Sarah had said lingered between us. She nodded, but the distant look didn't fade. The light mood that had previously dominated the atmosphere was now becoming a bit darker. With the tent set up and daylight beginning to fade, we decided to light a campfire. The crackling of the flames brought some comfort, and soon we were sitting around it, telling stories and laughing, trying to forget the tension that had arisen. But something felt different. The forest seemed to vibrate around us, and the shadows cast by the flames danced in an unsettling manner. It was as if nature were whispering secrets we weren't ready to hear. "I heard the forest has a way of making you face your fears," Ben said, looking into the flames. "I think that's why there are so many legends surrounding it. It knows what you fear and exposes it." His voice had a teasing tone, but as he spoke, the atmosphere around us shifted. The whispers that had once been mere distant echoes began to intensify, as if the forest were responding. "You're just trying to scare us again," Sarah said, her voice trembling as she looked around. "Ben, this isn't funny." But there was a mix of anxiety and curiosity in her gaze. I felt it too, a rising tension that made it hard to relax. What should have been a moment of unwinding was turning into something more unsettling. The flames crackled, and the smell of burning wood filled the air, but the whispers continued, as if the forest were conversing among itself. I couldn't understand what they were saying, but there was an urgency in them, a calling that seemed to penetrate my mind. "Did you hear that?" I asked, trying to break the heavy mood. "Hear what? Are you going crazy?" Ben replied, laughing nervously. But I wasn't joking. There was something there that made my heart race. The whispers seemed louder now, more insistent. It sounds like someone is talking, I insisted, looking at Sarah, who now also appeared nervous. I don't like this, she murmured, looking around as if expecting something to emerge from the shadows. Ben tried to divert attention by poking the fire with a stick, but the tension was palpable, as if the forest were watching us, waiting. It could just be the wind, he suggested, but his voice trembled slightly, and I realized he too had felt the shift. This wasn't just fear of urban legends or ghost stories, it was a visceral feeling that something was off. The night was falling, and darkness seemed to creep closer, as if it were swallowing the light of the fire. Let's move away from the fire a bit, I suggested, trying to find some way to ease the oppressive atmosphere. How about we take a quick walk and explore a little? But as I spoke, I realized I wasn't sure if it was a good idea. The forest seemed alive, and the thought of stepping away from the safety of the light felt increasingly risky. Are you sure? It doesn't seem safe, Sarah said, her expression revealing concern. I could feel the tension rising among us, but curiosity was strong as well. Let's just take a quick look. It won't hurt. Ben agreed, and though she was reluctant, Sarah eventually joined us. As we moved away from the fire, a strange sensation settled in me. The forest seemed shrouded in a veil of mystery, and the whispers were now louder, almost as if we were being called. The moonlight filtered through the treetops, casting long and unsettling shadows that danced in front of us. This is weird, I murmured as we pressed forward. Don't you think this is too much? But before anyone could respond, I noticed that Sarah had started to drift away, drawn to something among the trees. Sarah, wait! I shouted, but the forest seemed to envelop her in a trance. She's not listening, Ben said, his voice low, as we watched Sarah move away. What's happening to her? Fear began to spread between us, and I felt a growing pressure in the air, as if the forest were testing us. We need to go after her, I said, my heart pounding in my chest. We can't leave her alone. And without hesitating, I followed her, with Ben right behind me. The path was dark and tangled, and with each step, my fear began to morph into rising panic. When we finally found her, she was standing still, with a distant look in her eyes, as if lost in another world. Sarah! I called, but she didn't respond. Instead, she began murmuring words I couldn't understand, as if the forest were speaking to her. The glow that had drawn her seemed to emanate from a hidden place, and I didn't know what to think. She's not okay, Ben whispered, looking at me with concern. We need to take her back. But something inside me hesitated. It was as if the forest were trying to show us something we couldn't ignore. The whispers grew louder, and I felt that there was a deeper connection there, something we couldn't comprehend. Sarah, come back to us. I shouted, but her expression remained unchanged. It was as if she were in a trance, and the forest was calling for her. And as silence descended, I realized that this forest was not just a place but a labyrinth of emotions, memories, and secrets that were about to be revealed. Night was slowly falling over the forest, and a sense of expectation hung in the air. ####, the sky was becoming a cloak of stars, but the moonlight could barely penetrate the thick canopy of the trees. As we set up the tent, Ben's joking attempts to lighten the mood only seemed to deepen the tension that was settling around us. Did you guys know there are legends about this forest? They say some who get lost here never come back, Ben said with a sarcastic smile. He was trying to ease the atmosphere, but his words only amplified my unease. I glanced at Sarah, who was silent, her expression distant, as if she were lost in some deep thought. Oh, come on, Ben. You're just messing with us, I replied, forcing a laugh. I think we've had enough scary stories for one night. He chuckled, but his laughter didn't reach his eyes. You don't believe, do you? I bet there's something here you don't know about. Something that whispers in the shadows. Knock it off, man. We don't need more fantasies. Let's just enjoy the night, I tried to change the subject, but I knew the atmosphere was shifting. The air felt heavy, and I could sense that the forest was watching us. After setting up the tent, we decided to sit around the campfire. The crackling flames were comforting, but as the night wore on, the environment grew more oppressive. Sarah, who had been quiet until then, stared into the fire with a distant look. "Sometimes, I feel like the forest calls to me," she murmured, almost as if she were speaking to herself. "It reminds me of my brother. He loved coming here. He would hike and get lost for hours. I used to worry, but he always came back." The silence that followed was heavy. Ben and I exchanged glances, and I felt that mentioning Sarah's brother brought up something she preferred to keep buried. "You don't have to worry. He'll always be with you, somewhere," I said, trying to comfort her, but the truth was, I had no idea how to respond to that pain. "Yeah, but I can't help it. Sometimes it feels like he's here, but I also feel like he'll never come back," Sarah replied, her voice almost a whisper. The firelight illuminated her face, but there was a shadow of sadness in her eyes that made my throat tighten. The night continued to deepen, and the whispers began to manifest. It was as if the forest was murmuring ancient secrets, and we were mere listeners. A cold breeze passed through, causing the flames of the campfire to flicker. "What was that?" Chris asked, looking around, his face reflecting confusion and concern. "It must just be the wind," Ben replied quickly, though his voice sounded hesitant. "This forest can be a little strange at night." "Strange? You mean scary?" "I don't like this," Chris said, glancing into the darkness beyond the campfire's light. "We should do something to distract ourselves. How about a walk? A nighttime hike could be fun." I hesitated. "A walk? At night? I don't know if that's a good idea. What if we get lost?" The thought of distancing ourselves from the safety of the campfire and stepping into that darkness was terrifying. "Oh, come on, are you scared? Don't be a coward. It's just a little adventure," Chris insisted, trying to cheer up the group. But at that moment, I felt the pressure in the air, as if the forest were watching us, waiting for the right moment to swallow us whole. "I don't know, it doesn't feel safe," I replied, trying to hide my discomfort. But Ben, in a moment of bravado, decided we would go. "Let's do this. We can't let fear control us. What do you think, Sarah?" He looked at her, who was still lost in thought. I don't know. Maybe we should stay. I feel like something isn't right," she murmured, but her hesitation wasn't enough to stop Ben. "Don't be scared. Let's explore a bit. We're here to have fun." Ben's insistence was contagious, and reluctantly, I ended up agreeing. "All right, let's go then. But if anything happens, you're responsible, Ben." The walk began with a sense of excitement, but it quickly turned uncomfortable. The forest was alive, with sounds that seemed to intensify as we moved away from the warmth of the campfire. Shadows moved in strange ways, and the whispering that had been a distant echo now felt like it was surrounding us. "It's just your imagination, man. Look at the stars. See how they shine," Ben said, trying to keep our spirits up, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. "I don't know if I'm liking this," I confessed, glancing around, but the truth was that every step we took felt like it was pulling us further away from the safety of the campfire. "Come on, it's just a forest." "You're acting like we're in a horror movie," Chris commented, but his voice sounded tense. There was a growing anxiety in his tone, something I couldn't ignore. As we walked, I noticed that Sarah was drifting away from the group. She seemed entranced, as if something were calling to her. "Hey, Sarah, where are you going?" I shouted, but she didn't respond. She continued to move away, drawn to a strange glow emanating between the trees. "Sarah!" Ben called out, but she appeared hypnotized. "We need to go after her," Chris said, and we exchanged nervous glances before heading in her direction. The darkness seemed to engulf everything around us, and the light grew more intense as we approached her. When we finally found her, she was standing in front of a tree, murmuring words we couldn't understand. Her gaze was distant, as if she were in another world. "Sarah, what's happening?" I asked, but there was no response. "Sarah, come back. What are you doing?" Ben was visibly worried, and I could feel the tension rising around us. The forest seemed alive, as if it were absorbing the energy of the moment. "She's not here, not really here," I said, trying to comprehend the situation. "Sarah, listen to our voices." But she continued to murmur, and the glow seemed to envelop her, drawing her towards something we couldn't see. I exchanged glances with Ben and Chris, and the sense that something was terribly wrong hit me hard. "We need to do something," Chris said, his voice rising. "We can't leave her here." And before we could think of an alternative, Ben stepped forward, reaching out to touch Sarah. "Sarah! Come back to us," he shouted, and at that moment, the glow seemed to pulse, as if responding to his call. The forest around us appeared to pause, and the murmuring grew louder, as if protesting against our intervention. The tension escalated, and the silence that followed was deafening. Shadows danced around us, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were about to cross a line from which we couldn't return. The forest was testing us, and I was sure something was about to happen. The darkness of the forest seemed to live, twisting beneath the shadows of ancient trees. The smell of damp earth and dry leaves filled my nostrils as the campfire crackled, casting flickering light across our faces. The mood was tense, and even Chris's laughter echoed in a hollow space, devoid of joy. What had once been a cheerful campsite now felt like a shelter in an impending nightmare. "Did you hear that?" Ben broke the silence, his anxious gaze fixed on the shadows. He had always been the jokester of the group, but now his tone was serious. I followed his gaze, but all I saw were the trees, tall and unyielding, seemingly leaning in to listen to our conversation. "It's just the wind," Sarah replied, though her gaze was distant. I knew something troubled her. Her brother, lost in the forest, loomed over us like a specter. The weight of his absence seemed to thicken the air. He was always such a great hiker. "I just hope he's okay, wherever he is. He'd be here if he hadn't gotten into trouble," Ben said, trying to lighten the mood, but there was no joy in his voice. The flames of the campfire danced, and I wondered if the forest was listening, if there was something out there feeding on our insecurities. That night, the whispers began. At first, they were just subtle murmurs, like the sound of rustling leaves. Hashtag 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 as the voices grew clearer, it seemed they were conversing with each other in a language I couldn't comprehend. Fear began to settle in the pit of my stomach, and a shiver ran down my spine. "Did you guys hear that?" I asked, trying to keep my composure. "Huh, you're going crazy, man." Chris laughed, but there was a tension in his gaze. He looked into the darkness beyond the campfire light, as if waiting for something to emerge. "It's just the forest, dude. It does these things." "I don't know, Chris." Sarah's voice was tense. "It sounds different. Like it's trying to tell us something. Like the forest is alive." Ben teased, but his tone was so heavy with doubt that I couldn't laugh. I wondered if there truly was something supernatural in the woods, something we couldn't see but that was watching us. The campfire crackled, and the cold breeze seemed to blow harder, as if the forest was complaining about our presence. "Maybe we should go to sleep," I suggested, but the idea unsettled me. The forest felt like a place that didn't want to be disturbed. However, the fear of the dark and the unknown made me want to crawl into my sleeping bag and wait for morning to arrive. "No, let's do something fun," Chris exclaimed, standing up. "How about a night hike?" He smiled, but there was a strange glint in his eyes. "A hike? No," Ben replied, clearly hesitant. "Wouldn't it be better to wait until morning?" "Relax, the forest isn't going to eat us," Chris insisted, almost defiantly. Come on, it'll be an adventure. I looked at Sarah, who seemed uncertain. You don't want to go, right? I asked. She shook her head, her expression distant. I just don't know. Something doesn't feel right, she murmured, her eyes wandering to the darkness surrounding our camp. Come on, Sarah. You can't let a little darkness keep you from having fun. Chris said, trying to convince her. But I could see that fear was settling into her heart. I don't want to stray far from the group, she finally replied, her gaze fixed on me. The tension in the air was almost palpable, and I knew that any wrong move could trigger something terrible. I don't think we should go, I said, trying to sound firm. The forest has already given us signs that we're not alone. Oh, don't be like that. Come on, a little excitement won't hurt, Chris insisted, but I could feel his tone losing confidence. There was something in his expression that made me uneasy. I just don't want anything to happen, Sarah said, her gaze fixed on the darkness. And suddenly, as if the forest were responding to our fear, a whisper rose louder and clearer, slicing through the air and making our hearts race. Did you hear that? Ben asked, his voice almost a whisper. He turned, eyes wide. It was like a voice. I don't want to stay here anymore, Sarah said, her voice trembling slightly. Let's go back to the tent. Calm down, Sarah, Chris said, trying to soothe her. We just need a little courage. A hike will make us feel better. But it was at that moment that something inside me decided I could no longer ignore the signs. Chris, no. Let's go back. This is not a good idea. He hesitated, but the determination in his gaze didn't waver. Just a little further, I promise. If you don't like it, we'll turn back. And so, still reluctant, I ended up agreeing, and in a moment of weakness, we stood up and followed Chris down the dark path. The trees seemed to close in around us, and each step we took echoed in the darkness like a warning. As we walked, something began to pull Sarah away. She drifted from the group, her gaze fixed on a distant glow between the trees. Sarah, where are you going? I shouted, but the forest seemed to swallow my voice. The feeling that something was wrong intensified. I don't know, she replied, her voice distant, as if she were in a trance. I'm drawn to something. Come back. Ben shouted, but his voice was lost in the rising whispers now filling the air around us. It was as if the forest itself was calling to her, and fear settled in my heart. Sarah, no. I yelled, but when we finally reached her, she stood under a tree, her eyes glazed over, murmuring words we couldn't understand. The glow that attracted her pulsed as if it had a life of its own. Sarah. Chris approached, his voice now filled with concern. What are you doing? She didn't answer, continuing to murmur, and the expression on her face was one of pure surrender. Fear turned to panic in my chest, and I wanted to scream, but something held me back. The forest felt alive, and I sensed its presence, watching our every move. Sarah, come back. I said, my voice almost pleading. This isn't safe. Finally, she seemed to hear me, but not before an even louder whisper echoed around us. She cannot return, a deep, resonant voice said, as if it came from all sides. She belongs to us now. Reality shattered around us, and I realized the forest was not just a backdrop but a living, conscious entity. Panic gripped me, and I pulled Sarah back, trying to make her see the truth. But the expression on her face was one of complete surrender, as if she were connecting with something we couldn't see. Sarah, please. I implored, while Ben gripped her arm, trying to bring her back to her senses. Don't let yourself be taken. I'm listening, she murmured, as if it were a hypnotic song. Her eyes reflected a strange light, and I knew we had to act quickly. Fear enveloped me, and the forest felt like it was closing in on us, as if preparing to devour us whole. Let's go back now. I said, already pulling her away. Chris hesitated for a moment, but finally joined us, and together we began to retreat down the path. The whispers intensified, and I felt that something terrible was about to happen. Tension hung in the air as we tried to find our way back, but the forest seemed to shift around us, as if altering the very paths we knew. Despair replaced fear when we finally realized we were lost. And so, the whispers turned into screams, and the darkness became an oppressive presence, turning into an endless maze. And now? What do we do? Ben asked, his voice trembling. Panic reflected in his eyes, and I knew we needed to find an exit, but the forest appeared to be closing in. The darkness of the wood seemed to have gained a life of its own, and each step we took echoed in an empty space, as if the forest itself were listening. The air was thick with oppressive silence, and all we could hear was the pounding of our hearts, quickened by adrenaline and fear. Chris had vanished, and the thought that he might be in danger sent me into a panic. "We need to find him," I asserted, my voice shaking. Sarah and Ben nodded, but the look on their faces showed that even they were terrified. As we began to follow Chris's footprints in the mud, each step became harder. The forest seemed to thicken around us, shadows stretching and contorting in strange ways. "Why would he wander off like this?" Ben murmured, glancing around as if expecting something to leap from the shadows. "This doesn't make sense." He was so excited for the camping trip. "Maybe he saw something," I suggested, trying to convince myself there was a logical explanation. But the truth was that the forest was manipulating us, and each time I looked at the trees, I felt as if they were closing in around us. Finally, we came across a massive ancient tree, its exposed roots reminiscent of cold fingers crawling through the ground. "Hey, what's this?" Ben said, crouching to examine something buried beneath the roots. "It looks like a diary." Hashtag. He pulled out the object, and the leather cover was worn, marked by time. My heart raced inside me. What could be written there? What else did this forest hide? "Let's read it," I suggested, moving closer. Ben opened the diary, revealing yellowed pages that seemed to be covered in dust and moisture. The words were hard to read, but as we began to decipher them, a sense of dread washed over me. "Look at this," Ben started to read aloud. "This forest is a place of solace, but also of deprivation. Those who get lost here are not just lost, they are consumed by their emotions." Sarah, who was beside me, began to tremble. "What does that mean?" Her voice was a whisper. "What's happening here?" "Calm down, we're here together," I tried to comfort her, but the truth was that I was just as scared as she was. Ben continued to read, the tension on his face increasing with each word. "The entity that inhabits this forest feeds on our deepest fears and desires. Those who surrender to it are promised solace in exchange for their souls." With every sentence that Ben read, the forest seemed to stir around us, as if we were awakening something that should have remained dormant. "This is a curse," I murmured, realizing the atmosphere was shifting. The air felt colder, and a chilling breeze began to blow, causing the leaves to whisper even louder. When Ben turned the page, his eyes widened. "Here it says that, those who gather in groups must always be vigilant. The entity feeds on despair and the desire for connection, and when a group divides, it can strike. This can't be real." I shouted, adrenaline mingling with panic. "We need to get out of here before it's too late." But before we could decide what to do, a shadow moved swiftly between the trees, and a distant scream echoed through the forest, making our hearts race. "Chris," we shouted in unison, but there was no response. The silence that followed was deafening. The forest seemed alive, and I felt a growing pressure in my chest, as if it were trying to ensnare us. "Let's go back," I suggested desperately, but when I looked at Sarah, I noticed she was pale and gasping for breath. "Sarah, are you okay?" I asked, but before she could respond, her legs gave out, and she collapsed to the ground. "Sarah!" Ben and I rushed to her, and a wave of panic hit me. What was happening? As we tried to wake her, I saw a look of pain and fear on her face. "She's having a vision," murmured Ben, and as he said that, a strange light began to glow around us, coming from deeper within the forest. It was as if the forest itself was calling to Sarah, and a shiver ran down my spine. When Sarah finally woke up, her eyes were glassy, and she seemed to be in shock. "I saw," she began, her voice trembling. "The entity, it wants to feed on our emotions. It feeds on what we feel, on what we desire. How can we stop it?" I asked, anxiety growing within me. The idea of being consumed by something so terrible was almost unbearable. "We need to confront it," Sarah said, but her voice was laced with uncertainty. "But I don't know how. The forest is changing, and it knows we're here." Ben and I exchanged glances, realizing we were in a place where logic no longer applied. Whatever was watching us was always one step ahead. "We need to find Chris," I insisted. "He might still be in danger." With that, we started moving again, but every step felt heavier than the last. The shadows were thicker, and the trees seemed to close in around us. The forest was isolating us. What had once been a clear path was now becoming a confusing, dead-end labyrinth. "Let's remember what we read," I suggested, trying to keep calm. "We can't let ourselves be divided. We need to stay together." But the truth was that the forest was beginning to turn into a nightmare, and the sensation of being watched intensified with each passing moment. When we finally found a small clearing, a place where the moonlight illuminated the leaf-covered ground, we stopped to catch our breath. "Is it safe here?" Ben asked, looking around suspiciously. "Maybe for a moment," I said, but deep down, I knew the peace was temporary. The diary had mentioned that the entity was cunning, and we were the prey in its web. The forest was alive, and we were in its territory. Sarah began to speak again, her words heavy with fear. "What if the entity really does feed on our emotions? What will we do if it tries to divide us?" "We can't let that happen," I replied, determined. "We need to find Chris and figure out how to stop this." But as I spoke, a wave of despair began to engulf me. What if Chris didn't want to come back? What if he was losing the battle against the entity? The forest seemed to breathe around us, and the feeling of being watched intensified. The whisper returned, louder than before, and fear settled in our hearts. With each moment, reality seemed to fade, and I wondered if we would make it out of this forest alive. Was it just a legend, or did this forest truly possess powers we couldn't comprehend? The air was heavy, as if the forest were holding its breath. While Sarah lay unconscious, my heart raced, and despair consumed me. I didn't know what to do. The image of her collapsed on the ground was a vision I couldn't unsee. Chris, beside me, seemed just as lost as I was. "Sarah, please wake up," I said, crouching beside her and holding her body. "You need to come back." After what felt like an eternity, Sarah began to open her eyes slowly. Her gaze was distant, as if she were trying to remember where she was. The forest around us seemed to pulse, and the whispers, once muffled, grew louder, as if everything around us was stirring in anticipation. "Sarah?" Chris asked, his voice trembling. "Are you okay?" She sat up abruptly, her eyes wide, as if waking from a nightmare. I saw something," she said, breathless. "The forest, it wants something from us." "What does it want?" I pressed, anxious. "What did you see?" "The entity that lives here," she murmured, staring into the void. "It wants to feed on our deepest emotions. Fear, sadness, pain, all of it is like a feast for it." "That can't be true," Chris exclaimed, shaking his head. "This is just a legend. We can't believe this." "But it's real, Chris," Sarah insisted, her words gaining strength. "I felt it. It feeds on us, on our pain. And if we don't do something, we'll be consumed." The silence in the forest was deafening, and the whisper that once seemed distant now turned into a cacophony of voices, as if the forest itself was manifesting. The sensation that something was watching us enveloped us, and I couldn't shake the idea that the entity was closer than we thought. "We need to get out of here," I said, urgency rising in my voice. "If it feeds on emotions, maybe we should try not to feel anything. Let's focus on something positive." "That's easier said than done," Chris retorted, his expression grim. "You didn't see what it did to Sarah. We have to find a way to defeat it." "But how?" I asked, looking at Sarah. "What did she say exactly?" "The entity, it feeds on our deepest fears," Sarah explained, her voice now stronger. "And I saw people who got lost in the forest, their souls are trapped here. We need to free them." "Free them?" Chris asked, confused. "But how can we do that if we don't even know where they are?" The entity uses our fears against us," Sarah said, looking down. "If we can confront them, maybe we can find a way to free the souls and save ourselves." "Confront our fears?" I repeated, a wave of panic rising in my spine. "What if it destroys us?" "It's a risk we have to take," Sarah insisted, determination shining in her eyes. "We have to try. If we don't do something, we'll just be another part of this forest." ###, but what if we can't do it? Chris asked, his voice trembling. "What if we end up like them?" "I don't know," Sarah admitted, a flicker of vulnerability crossing her face. "But we have to try. We can't let her win." The trees around us seemed to lean in, as if they were listening to our conversation. The whispers grew louder, and a cold breeze swept through, making the branches sway. I felt the pressure in the air, as if the forest was reacting to us. "It's getting stronger," I said, fear rising in my chest. "I can feel it. We need to act quickly." "Then let's focus on our fears," Sarah said, taking a deep breath. "Let's share what haunts us. Only then can we confront them." Chris hesitated, but then nodded slowly. "Okay. I'll start." He stepped back a bit, and I noticed the forest seemed to contract around us, as if paying attention. "My biggest fear is losing the people I love without being able to do anything. I've always been afraid of not being enough, of not being able to protect them." His voice trembled, but he pushed on. "When I saw Sarah drifting away, I thought I would never see her again." I looked at Sarah, who had tears in her eyes. "Chris, you can't think like that. You've always been there for us. You've always done your best." "I know, but it's hard," he replied, the pain in his voice palpable. "And now, with all of this, I feel like I'm losing control." "It's the entity that wants that," Sarah said, placing her hand on his arm. "It's feeding on your pain, on your insecurity. You need to fight against it." The forest seemed to shift, as if absorbing the sadness radiating from him. I knew it was our turn to share. "My fear," I began, hesitating. "My fear is never being able to move on. I'm always worried about what others think of me. The pressure to be perfect, it's overwhelming. And now, with all this, I feel like I'm failing." "You're not failing," Chris said quickly. "We're in this together. We have to stick together." Sarah looked at us, and for a moment, I saw a glimmer of hope in her eyes. "Now it's your turn, Sarah," I encouraged her. "What's your biggest fear?" She hesitated, looking down, and the forest seemed to silence, waiting for her response. "My fear is losing the memory of my brother," she finally said, her voice choked. "I feel like, as time passes, I'm forgetting who he was. The forest makes me remember him, but it also reminds me of the emptiness he left behind." I felt a tightness in my heart. "Sarah, you'll never forget him. He will always be with you, in your heart." "But what if the forest tries to erase that too?" she asked, tears streaming down her face. "What if I end up like those lost souls?" The whispers grew louder, and the temperature suddenly dropped. The pressure in the air seemed to intensify, and I realized the entity was closing in. "We need to focus," I said, feeling the urgency. "We have to fight against this together." "Yes," Sarah agreed, wiping her tears. "Let's unite against the entity. We can't let her win." At that moment, a scream echoed through the forest, a sharp and painful sound that pierced the silence. I looked around, the feeling that we were being watched growing stronger by the second. "Was that you?" Chris asked, looking at me, fear etched on his face. "No, it wasn't me," I replied, panic starting to settle in my chest. "It was something else." The forest seemed to stir, and the whispers turned into a deafening clamor. "It's coming," Sarah said, her voice filled with terror. "She's here." Fear spread like wildfire through my body. The entity was approaching, drawn to our emotions, and I didn't know if we could face it. I looked at my friends' faces, saw determination and fear, and realized the only way to confront it was together. "Let's do this," I said, my voice steady. "Let's face the entity and free the souls. We can't let our emotions feed it. We need to unite." "Yes," Chris and Sarah said in unison, and I felt a spark of hope. The forest was alive, and we knew the fight was just beginning. The darkness of the forest seemed to deepen with every step we took. The air was heavy, and the whisper of the wind seemed to carry away our thoughts, making everything around us feel increasingly surreal. Fear began to settle in our hearts, and the sense of being lost grew deeper. The idea that the forest had a life of its own no longer felt like an urban legend told by Ben, it was an oppressive reality surrounding us. "Why are we doing this?" I asked, my voice barely escaping my lips. The echo of the question was lost in the darkness, and I could barely recognize the shape of my friends beside me. Ben and Sarah stayed close, but even so, there was an invisible distance between us, as if the forest was trying to separate us. "We need to find a way back," Ben replied, his voice tense. He was trying to keep calm, but I could see the unease in his eyes. "Let's just keep moving forward. I believe the trail will lead us back to camp." "I don't know, something isn't right here," Sarah murmured, her expression distant. She seemed lost in thoughts, and I knew the memory of her lost brother weighed heavily on her. The forest, with its twisted trees and dancing shadows, seemed to whisper secrets we weren't ready to hear. We continued to walk, but with each step, the environment around us became stranger. The trees appeared to bend at impossible angles, and the ground became uneven, as if it were trying to swallow us. The feeling of being watched grew with each passing moment, and the oppressive silence made my heart race. "Look, over there!" Ben exclaimed, pointing to a pathway opening between the trees. "Let's go that way. It might lead us back." We approached the trail, but I hesitated. Something felt off. The air was cold, and a thick fog began to form, wrapping around us like a heavy cloak. "Do you guys feel that?" I asked, my voice almost a whisper. "Feel what?" Ben shot back, but I noticed he was hesitating too. Sarah's gaze was fixed on a point ahead, as if she was perceiving something we couldn't see. "Come on, let's keep going." The forest seemed alive, pulsing around us. The trees, with their exposed roots, appeared to move, whispering in a language we couldn't understand. "We can't stay here," Sarah said, her voice laden with anxiety. "Chris could be in danger." "Let's go," I agreed, but with every step we took, the sensation that the forest was manipulating us increased. The path that once seemed promising now became a labyrinth. Each tree looked identical to the last, and fear began to swell in my chest, like a weed. Then something caught my attention. A faint, flickering light filtered through the trees. "What is that?" I murmured, pointing to the glow. It was a strange light, almost hypnotic. Curiosity overtook fear, and without thinking, I started moving toward it. "We should see what it is." "Wait." Don't get too close. Ben shouted, but his voice seemed distant. The glow called to me, and I couldn't resist. I need to see what it is. Ben, no. Sarah yelled, but my determination propelled me forward. I drifted away from them, feeling my heart race. The light was mesmerizing, pulsing in a rhythm that seemed to sync with my own heartbeat. The forest around me began to fade, and I found myself in a lit space, surrounded by trees that seemed to bend to observe me. The glow intensified, and around it, shadows danced, forming indistinct figures that appeared to be watching me. Chris. I called, but my voice did not echo. Instead, the silence deepened. The light began to dim slowly, and suddenly, a figure appeared among the shadows. It was Chris, but he didn't look the same. His eyes were hollow, as if there was no life left in them. He was trapped by something I couldn't see, and his smile was unsettling. You finally arrived, he said, his voice resonating in a way that didn't sound human. Chris. ###, what happened to you? I stepped closer, but something held me back. The air around us was thick with a palpable tension, and a chilling sensation ran down my spine. The forest is a place of solace, he said, his words drawn out, as if each syllable cost him effort. It embraces those who seek something they've lost. But you're not okay. We need to get out of here. I pleaded, trying to grasp what was happening. Chris's vacant gaze reflected a darkness we couldn't comprehend. You don't understand, he replied, his voice now a whisper. I found what I was looking for. The forest gave me what I wanted. You. What do you mean? What did the forest give you? Anguish filled my voice as I tried to reach him. What had happened to my friend? The forest, it feeds on emotions, Chris continued, his smile widening disturbingly. It gave me the chance to feel again, the presence of my brother. Chris, this isn't right. You can't stay here. I felt desperation swell within me. What he was saying made no sense. The forest was manipulating him, and I needed to bring him back to reality. He stepped towards me, but the expression on his face changed. You don't understand. The forest is a place where desires become reality. You just have to surrender. Surrender? Chris, this is a trap. I shouted, but he seemed lost in his own words, as if hypnotized by the very darkness surrounding him. The glow around him pulsed, and the shadows danced even more wildly. Live for your emotions, and you will find peace, he murmured. The forest, it wants you to join me. Panic surged within me. Chris was no longer in his right mind. He had lost himself to the forest, and I knew I had to save him. Let's go back, Chris. We can't stay here. I implored, reaching out my hand toward him. But the forest seemed to stir around us, as if reacting to our despair. The trees leaned closer, and I felt a growing pressure in the air. The forest won't let you go, Chris whispered, and his words sounded like a warning. No, that can't be true. I didn't want to believe it, but reality was unfolding before me, and the truth was terrifying. The forest was alive and had dark intentions. You will regret not surrendering, he said, and a chill ran down my spine. There was something profoundly wrong in his expression. He was being controlled, and the forest was feeding on his pain. Chris, please. Fight this. Remember who you are. I shouted, desperately trying to reach him, but the forest seemed to oppose every word I uttered. The air was heavy, and the pressure mounted with each passing moment. You don't understand, he shouted back, his tone filled with a pain I couldn't comprehend. The forest is a home for those who have been lost. You can't fight this. I won't let you get lost. I was about to take a step forward, but the shadows began to writhe, as if wanting to hold me back. The glow around us started to fade, and panic consumed me. Chris, no. Come with me. Then reality began to distort. The trees morphed into shadows, and the air filled with a distant echo, as if the forest were laughing at us. The light vanished, and an oppressive darkness enveloped the place. I was about to lose Chris forever, and despair transformed into a silent scream echoing in my mind. What was this forest? What did it want from us? The truth seemed to slip through my fingers, and the struggle for freedom was just beginning. The forest's last breath could be our own. The air was heavy, as if the forest itself were breathing, and darkness seemed to writhe around us. Chris stood there, but something was wrong. His eyes, once full of life and humor, were now like black holes, empty and expressionless. A shiver ran down my spine. "Chris." I called, hesitantly. "Is that you?" He slowly turned his head, a disturbing smile forming on his lips. "The forest is a place of solace," he said, his voice sounding almost like a distant echo. The tone of his words unsettled me. There was something sinister in his expression, something that told me he wasn't fully there. "Chris, are you okay?" Sarah asked, her gaze fixed on her friend. "What happened to you?" He stepped forward, and the forest seemed to shift around him, as if alive, responding to his presence. "I found peace here," he declared, with a voice that sounded ethereal. "The forest embraced me, gave me what I always sought." "You're talking as if you're under a spell," I said, trying to understand. "Chris, we need to go back. This isn't good for you. Go back." He laughed, but it wasn't the laugh I knew. It was cold and distant, as if he were amused by our confusion. "You don't understand. Here, I can feel everything again. The pain, the joy, the sadness, everything. And the forest, it protects me." "Protects from what?" Sarah insisted, her voice trembling. "Chris, this isn't you. Remember who you are. We can't stay here." He blinked slowly, as if waking from a trance. "You don't see. The forest feeds on our fears and desires. It wants to make us feel, to succumb to our own ghosts." "So you're saying the forest is controlling you?" I asked, my heart racing. "Chris, fight this. You're stronger than it." He hesitated, and I saw a glimmer of recognition in his eyes. "But what I want, is to be with my brother again. That's what the forest gave me." His voice dropped, almost a whisper. "It promised I could see him again." "Chris, that can't be true." Sarah cried, desperate. "This is an illusion. You can't trade your freedom for a desire that may never come true." He shook his head, looking confused. "But you don't understand, Sarah. The pain of losing someone is unbearable. The forest, it's the only one that can help me feel that again." "But at what cost?" I interjected, trying to find a way to bring him back. "Chris, you can't give in to this. The forest isn't your friend." "It gave me everything I wished for," he replied, his voice soft but firm. "And now, it protects me. I can't go back." At that moment, a shadow swept quickly between the trees, and a scream echoed through the forest, cutting the air like a knife. Our hearts raced. "Chris, we have to get out of here," I said, grabbing his arm. But he pulled away, as if an invisible barrier kept him trapped. "You can't take me back," he said, and the expression on his face shifted to something darker. "You don't understand what the forest is offering. To me, it's a shelter, a home. And I can't leave it. You're not home here." Sarah shouted, her voice resonating in the silence of the night. "You can't give up everything for a desire, Chris. Think of us, think of your life outside of here." He looked at us, and for a brief moment, I felt a flicker of doubt in his eyes. "But what do I have outside the forest? The pain, the loneliness, isn't that what we all feel? We feel it, but we can't let it consume us." I replied, urgency rising in my voice. "The forest is manipulating you. Fight against this idea, Chris. He seemed to hesitate, and for a moment, his eyes shone with a light that felt human. I want to fight, but... He looked down, as if battling an internal struggle. What if this is all I have? It's not. It can't be. Sarah exclaimed. You have us, Chris. You have friends who care about you. Don't let the forest tell you otherwise. I don't know if I can, he murmured, and the shadow in his gaze seemed to deepen. The forest is so powerful. It gave me what I never thought I could have again. But at a price you can't afford. I said, feeling frustration and fear building inside me. If you give in to this, you'll never come back. You'll become part of the forest, part of the darkness. Hashtag, I can't lose this, he whispered, and for a moment, the sadness on his face made my heart ache. The pain of losing my brother is unbearable. The forest offers me a way to feel that again. I can't let this slip away. Chris, no. Sarah shouted, her desperation growing. You can't sacrifice yourself like this. You still have a chance. Fight, please. And then, in a moment of clarity, he looked at us, and a tear rolled down his cheek. I want to fight, but, what if the entity offers me what I've always desired? What if I can finally find peace? You won't find peace here, only a prison, I said, my voice pleading. Chris, I won't let you get lost. We will find a way out of here together. You just have to trust us. He hesitated, and then, as if the forest was listening to our words, a cold wind swept around us. The darkness seemed to stir, and I realized the entity was drawing near, feeding off our emotions, our interactions. Chris. Sarah called again, her voice echoing in the darkness. Remember who you are. Remember us. Don't let the forest take control of you. He looked at us, and for a brief moment, I saw an internal struggle in his eyes. But then, something changed. The shadow surrounding him seemed to tighten, and he took a step back, as if being pulled into the darkness. No, Chris, no. I shouted, reaching out to him. Fight. You can overcome this. I don't know if I can, he murmured, his voice broken. The forest, it's so strong. But you're stronger. Sarah insisted, her voice full of determination. You can win this, we believe in you. And as the night deepened and the forest seemed to conspire against us, I realized the true battle was just beginning. The fight wasn't just for Chris's life, but for our own souls, and the forest was determined to consume us all. All we could do was fight against this darkness together, until the end. The oppressive atmosphere of the forest was becoming increasingly unbearable as we tried to process Chris's revelation. The entity's shadow loomed over us like a heavy cloak, and every step we took echoed into a deep, disconcerting void. I felt my heart racing in my chest, and Sarah's breath beside me was ragged, as if she were struggling against an invisible pressure. Chris, you need to come back, I tried to say, but my voice trembled with uncertainty. This isn't you. The forest is, it's controlling you. Chris looked at us, but his empty eyes reflected no recognition. It was as if his essence had been drained, and in its place was merely an echo of the person we knew. The forest is a place of comfort, he repeated, a disturbing smile forming on his lips. Here, everyone can find what they have lost. You don't understand, Chris. This isn't comfort, it's a prison. Sarah exclaimed, her voice heavy with despair. You need to fight against this. He only shook his head slowly, as if trapped in a deep trance. I've already fought. But now I see the truth. The forest offers us what we desire. I just want to feel my brother again. That hit me like a blow. The revelation of his deepest desires, exposed so rawly, made me hesitate. Chris was lost, and the forest had devoured him, just as it could devour us if we weren't careful. It was as if we were trapped in a nightmare, surrounded by shadows and whispers that intensified with each passing moment. "Sarah, you need to remember your brother," I cried, trying to convince her to focus. "Remember what he represents, what you truly want. Don't let the forest control you." She closed her eyes, and a look of pain crossed her face. I can't. It's like the forest is feeding off me, off all my memories. I feel like I'm losing control." A cold breeze swept through the trees, and the whisper that had once been a soft murmur turned into a terrifying scream. The forest seemed alive, pulsing with a malignant energy that enveloped us. I looked around, searching for an escape, but the trees seemed to close in on us, forming a labyrinth of shadows. "We need to get out of here, now," I shouted, but my voice was lost in the darkness. "She won't let us go," Chris said, his voice now quieter, almost a whisper. "She feeds on us. And when you give in, you find what you desire." "No, you're wrong," I retorted, trying to maintain lucidity amid the chaos. "The forest is not a place of desire. It's a graveyard of souls." He laughed, but it was a joyless laugh, just an empty echo. "You still don't understand. The forest sees the truth. And the truth is that we all have something to lose. We all have something we will one day wish to have back." Sarah stepped closer to Chris, her expression of determination mingling with pain. "Chris, I know you're still there inside. You need to fight against this. Remember who you are." Her words seemed to resonate somewhere deep within him, and for a brief moment, I saw a glimmer of recognition in his eyes. I don't know if I can," he murmured, almost in lament. "You can," I said, nearly in desperation. "We need to face the entity. We need to prove we are stronger than our fears." At that moment, the forest seemed to react to our conversation. The trees stirred, and the whispers grew louder, almost as if mocking us. "You cannot escape," a deep voice echoed, resonating through the dense space. "Your emotions are mine." I felt a chill run down my spine. "What do you want from us?" I asked, my voice nearly lost in the darkness. "I want what is most precious to you. The pain, the joy, the desire, all of it can be mine. And in return, I can grant you what you long for most," the voice replied, and a shadow moved swiftly among the trees, making my stomach churn. "We can't let this control us," Sarah insisted, her determination growing. "We need to unite and face this. Together." Chris looked at her, and for a moment, I saw a glimpse of the old friend I knew, a spark of hope. "But what if she's right? What if she really can give us what we want?" he questioned, his voice trembling. "We can't do that," I exclaimed, feeling the pressure mount. "We can't sacrifice our freedom for illusions. The forest wants to divide us." "You're right," Sarah said, her voice now firmer. "Our fears are its weakness. We need to confront them and not let the forest manipulate us." As we spoke, the forest seemed to stir, as if it were listening to our words. It was a moment of clarity amid the chaos, and I realized that the true struggle was not against Chris or the entity, but against our own fears and desires. "Let's go together," I suggested, taking Sarah's hand and looking at Chris. "If you're still there, we need you. Fight against this." Chris hesitated, but finally nodded. I will try. "I don't want to get lost," he said, his voice heavy with emotion. The forest seemed to pulse in response, as if it were aware of the fight unfolding. "You cannot escape. You belong to me," the voice echoed again, stronger, more threatening. "No. We don't belong to you," I shouted, feeling a wave of courage rise within me. "We are more than our fears. Yes. We are more than this." Sarah yelled, her voice sounding like a hymn of determination. "We refuse to be your victims." With that, we began to move forward, step by step, facing the forest that tried to swallow us. I felt the weight of fear slowly dissipating, and the oppressive presence of the entity began to recede. The darkness around us started to fade, and the moonlight began to shine through the treetops, illuminating our path. "Let's go. We're almost there," I shouted, encouraging Chris and Sarah to keep moving. The forest's energy could not hold us back. It was at that moment I realized that the true battle was not just against the entity haunting us, but against the darkness we all carried within ourselves. Hashtag, and for a brief moment, I felt we were about to win this fight. However, the forest still held its secrets, and I sensed that the true test of our courage was yet to come. The path ahead remained uncertain, but together we were ready to face whatever lay ahead, determined not to be dominated by the entity or by the forest that sought to imprison us. The darkness of the forest seemed to intensify with every step we took. The air was heavy, as if nature itself were preparing for a confrontation. The sound of our footsteps on the damp earth echoed, soon muffled by an almost oppressive silence. The only thing we could hear were the whispers that followed us, as if the trees were conversing about us, assessing our fears and insecurities. "I think we're going the wrong way," I murmured, looking around in desperation. The trunks of the trees seemed to close in around us, forming a labyrinth that trapped us in its suffocating embrace. Sarah, who was just ahead of me, stopped and turned to face me. Her eyes were wide, reflecting the pale light of the moon that barely penetrated the dense canopy. "We need to find Chris. He must be somewhere around here," she said, but her voice faltered. There was something in her tone that worried me. "And what if he's not okay?" I asked, the thought sending a chill down my spine. "No, we can't think like that. He needs us," Sarah replied, determined, but I could see the doubt in her eyes. We continued walking, and soon we spotted a clearing ahead. My heart raced as I saw what appeared to be an ancient altar, covered in moss and surrounded by skeletons that seemed to belong to people who had once been there. What could have led those individuals to this place? The altar was shrouded in a dark aura, as if the forest itself were protecting a malignant entity. This is horrible," I whispered, stopping beside Sarah, who looked visibly shaken. "What happened here?" I don't know," she replied, her voice trembling. "But we need to be careful." Approaching the altar sent a shiver down my spine. It was clear that the forest was not willing to let us leave. "We need to do something," I suggested, but what could we do in the face of such a powerful force? The altar itself seemed to pulse with a sinister energy, and the presence of the skeletons around it only reinforced the idea that we were not the first to confront this entity. "Maybe we should try to destroy it," Sarah said, pointing to the altar. "If this is the source of the entity's power, maybe we can weaken her." "That's right, but how? We have nothing." I looked around, searching for anything that might be useful. Yet, the forest seemed to have drained all hope from us. "We need to use our fears against her," Sarah suggested, her voice growing steadier. "If this entity feeds on emotions, then perhaps we can create a distraction." "You're right. I can try to remember something that scares me. Something that can invoke her strength." I hesitated. "But you have to stay alert. We can't let her control us." We fell into a brief silence, both aware of what was at stake. It was as if the air around us was charged with tension, and in an instant, everything seemed to be in slow motion. The leaves whispered in the wind, and the sounds of nature grew increasingly distant. "Let's go," Sarah said, her determination renewed. Together, we approached the altar, and as we got closer, a wave of cold washed over our bodies. It felt as if the forest itself were preparing to attack us. "I can feel it," I murmured, "we can't hesitate." Sarah nodded and began to speak. "Entity that dwells in this forest, we have come here to confront you. We know of your power and how you feed on our fears. But we are not afraid of you." Her words echoed in the darkness, and a strong wind began to blow, causing the trees to sway. We felt the presence of the entity drawing near, and a shadow formed behind the altar. Its eyes seemed to glow with an insatiable desire, as if it were feeding off our determination. "Do you think you can challenge me?" a deep, distorted voice echoed through the clearing. "You are merely lost souls, and I am the guardian of this place. You have no power here. We are not lost," I shouted, trying to find my courage. "We came to find Chris, and we will not give up." "Chris," the entity murmured, its voice now filled with a malice that made my heart race. "He is one of mine now. One of you has already surrendered to me, and soon, you will too." Those words cut through the air like a sharp blade, and the truth began to form in my mind. "No. Chris is not yours. He is our friend." Sarah screamed, her voice full of despair. The shadows around the altar began to writhe, and then a grotesque shape started to emerge. It was a mixture of shadows and terror, with distorted faces rising from its surface. "You do not understand," the entity said, now closer. "I am the cure for your tormented souls. Surrender, and you will find solace." "No," I yelled, feeling the need to fight. "We do not need you. We have each other." The entity laughed, a sound that reverberated in our minds. "Do you truly believe you can defeat me? Here, I am everything. I am your fears, your deepest desires. I am the darkness that resides in each of you." "No," Sarah shouted, her voice now a scream of defiance. "We are not afraid of you." In a moment of clarity, I knew what I needed to do. "Sarah, let's destroy the altar. This is the source of her power." I pulled her closer to the altar, but the entity stirred, and its shadows began to extend toward us. "Quick! We need to do this before it's too late." "With what are we going to do that?" Sarah asked, desperate. "With our fears," I said, trying to organize my thoughts. "If she feeds off them, we need to use that to our advantage. I'll find a way to invoke our strength." I concentrated, trying to recall the darkest moments of my life, those that left me vulnerable and fragile. "I'm afraid of losing the people I love," I said, and as I spoke the words, a wave of energy began to build within me. "But I will not let you control me." Sarah joined me, her eyes shining with determination. "I'm afraid I won't be able to rescue my brother, but I will fight for him. I won't let you consume us." Together, we began to channel our emotions, the energy intensifying. The altar began to glow, and the shadows surrounding the entity started to writhe and recede. "No," the entity screamed, its voice now filled with rage. "You cannot do this." But we could. The altar began to respond to our call, and in a surge of strength, we united our voices, shouting, "We are not afraid of you." The entity twisted, and the air around us vibrated with the intensity of our challenge. We felt the energy of the forest surge, as if it were fighting against the entity. The altar, now pulsating with light, seemed to respond to our determination. With one last effort, we raised our hands, and a wave of light exploded, striking the entity. However, in the midst of our triumph, something unexpected happened. The shadows of the entity thrashed violently, and a deafening scream echoed through the forest. "You cannot defeat me. I am the essence of the forest. You will never escape." And as the light began to consume the entity, a final wave of darkness surged toward us, like a storm about to engulf us. "What's happening?" I shouted, feeling the energy spiral out of control. "We can't stop now. Stay focused." Sarah yelled, but the pressure from the entity was overwhelming. The altar began to fracture, and the skeletons around us started to move, as if awakening from a deep slumber. "No. It can't be." I screamed, feeling terror take hold of me. "Come on, we have to keep going." Sarah insisted, but the darkness was closing in fast, and the sense of despair began to envelop us. And as we fought against this overwhelming force, a new wave of light burst forth from the altar, and the entity began to dissolve into shadows. ####, but just as we were about to celebrate, an even darker presence began to emerge, and the true challenge was only just beginning. The air was heavy, almost oppressive, as I faced Chris, who was now revealing himself to be the very entity that had haunted us in the forest. The moonlight filtered through the dense foliage, casting shadows that danced around us, as if the forest itself were alive, watching our every move. My heart raced in my chest, and the revelation hit me like a punch to the stomach. You were the entity all along. I could barely form the words. The betrayal was palpable, and the feeling of despair mixed with anger. Chris, or what was left of him, smiled, a hollow smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I am not just the entity," he said, his voice echoing like a distant whisper, "I am the forest. I am all of this." He gestured widely, as if encompassing the vastness of the darkness around us. "And you, my dear friends, are merely more souls to be consumed. The forest always wins." "No. That can't be true," I shouted, trying to remember who he was, who he had been. The loyal and fun friend who was always there. "You don't have to do this, Chris. Fight it." But he merely laughed, a sound that reverberated among the trees, scandalous and cruel. "Fight? That's what all of you do. But the truth is, I found what I've always sought. The desire to feel my brother's presence again was stronger than any friendship." His words struck me like sharp knives, and the pain of betrayal was almost unbearable. "And Sarah? You manipulated her. You used her to feed off her pain." I was furious. Hatred burned within me, but there was something deeper, an immense sadness for everything we had lost. "She was the easiest to seduce," Chris replied, with a tone of satisfaction. "Her emotions made her a perfect target. She has always been tied to pain, and now, she has become a part of me, a part of the forest. And soon, you will be too." His words reverberated in my mind, and understanding hit me like lightning. I was not just fighting for my life, I was fighting for Sarah, for her soul. The image of her sacrificing herself to save us filled my mind. I couldn't let her go. "Sarah," I murmured, my voice breaking. "I can't leave you like this." The forest around us seemed to pulse, as if feeding on the fear and uncertainty radiating from me. "You have no choice," Chris said, his form becoming more indistinct, tangled in the shadows. "Unless you join me. Feel the freedom that comes from surrendering to this darkness. Together, we will be invincible. I will never surrender to you." I shouted, a wave of courage rising within me. "I will never be part of this evil." And it was at that moment that I realized, the forest was not just a place of imprisonment, it was a labyrinth of emotions, a reflection of the fears and desires that each of us carried. I looked around, the shadows seeming to twist and move as if they wanted to swallow me. But there was a light, a spark of hope glowing within me. "I will fight," I declared, feeling the energy build inside me. Chris lunged, his hands transforming into claws, reaching out toward me. "You cannot win," he whispered, and I saw the darkness swirl around him. "The forest always wins." Then I heard Sarah's voice echoing in my mind, a memory of who she was. "You need to remember what truly matters," she told me, and the clarity of her words filled me with determination. "Love, fight, and don't give up. The light always conquers the darkness." With that strength, I charged at Chris, shouting, "I am not afraid of you." The darkness began to dissipate, but Chris laughed, a laugh that froze the blood in my veins. "You don't understand. I am the darkness." He lunged at me, and I was hit by a wave of emotions, pain, loss, the longing to be with those we love. But instead of succumbing, I let those emotions transform into strength. "If you are the darkness, then I am the light." I felt the energy of the forest shift, as if responding to my call. The ground beneath my feet began to vibrate, and the shadows around me seemed to hesitate. "No," Chris screamed, his form beginning to fade. This cannot be happening. It is too late, Chris. I replied, my voice echoing through the forest. You underestimated the power of love and friendship. You will never have our spirit. And then, I saw Sarah. Her image formed in the air, like a radiant spirit. You are not alone. I am here with you. Her presence enveloped me, and the light emanating from her began to consume the darkness surrounding Chris. No, he yelled, his voice now distorted. This is impossible. With one last effort, we united our strengths, and the light began to engulf the darkness. The altar that had imprisoned us trembled, and the ground beneath our feet opened up, revealing a deep abyss. Break free! I shouted. Free yourselves from the chains that bind you. The forest began to transform, the trees writhing and the shadows dissipating. Chris tried to resist, but the light was too powerful. No, no, he screamed, but his form dissolved into a cloud of shadows, being drawn into the abyss. You cannot do this. And with his last word, he vanished, and the forest began to calm. The darkness that had surrounded us dissipated, and light began to shine brilliantly, illuminating everything around us. The souls that had been imprisoned started to break free, floating toward the light. Sarah! I shouted, searching for her presence. The radiant form approached me, and I felt a wave of love and gratitude. You did it. I said, tears of joy streaming down my face. We did it. It is not the end, she replied, her voice gentle as a breeze. The forest still needs a guardian. The darkness may return, and they will need someone strong to protect them. I watched her, realizing that she had made the greatest sacrifice. But what about you? What will happen to you? My voice faltered, feeling the pain of loss creeping in again. I will be the light of this forest, she answered, her serene smile illuminating the space around us. And I will do this so that no one else suffers as we have suffered. You must move on. Remember me, but do not be trapped by the past. I don't want to lose you, I murmured, the sadness tightening my heart. You meant everything to me. You will never lose me, Sarah said, and the light around her began to shine brightly. I will always be with you, in your heart. Now go, and live the life you've always dreamed. With one last look at her, the light intensified, and Sarah transformed into an ethereal glow, floating toward the sky. I watched her disappear, and the pain of her absence enveloped me, but at the same time, a new strength was born within me. The forest was now peaceful, and the freed souls danced around me, whispering words of gratitude. I knew that the battle had not been in vain. Chris had been defeated, and the darkness that threatened to consume everything had been banished, at least for now. With a heavy heart, yet determined, I began to walk toward the exit of the forest. The sun was starting to rise on the horizon, and the daylight filled the space with hope. I knew that the journey didn't end here. The forest still needed a guardian, and I was ready to take on that responsibility. Thank you, Sarah, I whispered, looking up at the sky. I will live for both of us. And so, with the last echo of the forest resounding in my mind, I moved forward, ready to face whatever the future held for me.